The Jesuit State in Paraguay. Although one would have thought that the Spanish conquistadors had written an end to socialism in South America, it had a continuation nevertheless. Some 100 to 150 years later, in an area not far from the former Inca state, a political system in the Inca tradition was established in Paraguay by the Jesuits. The history of Spanish penetration into Paraguay begins in 1516, when Don Juan Díaz de Solís discovered the mouth of the Parana River and conquered the surrounding territories. In 1537, Juan de Salazar de Espinosa founded Asunción, the capital of the new province of Paraguay. The native inhabitants of Paraguay were Indians of the Guarani tribe. Missionary work among them was first undertaken by the Dominican monk Las Casas. The Jesuits took part in this effort later. With the realistic approach so typical of their order, they decided to make acceptance of Christianity practically advantageous and so attempted to protect their converts from the Indians' main enemy, the slave traders called Paulistas, from the state of São Paulo, the center of the slave trade at the time. Suppression of the slave trade had been beyond the Spanish crown's capabilities for years. Yet the Jesuits succeeded in providing security against raids for Indians in large areas of Paraguay. To achieve this, they accustomed the Indians to a sedentary life, placing them in large settlements called reductions. The first reduction was set up in 1609. It seems that a plan existed at first for the creation of a great state with access to the Atlantic Ocean, but Paulist raids made this impossible. Beginning in 1640, the Jesuits armed the Indians and fought through to an area where they settled their flock. It was almost inaccessible, bordered on one side by the Andes and on the other by the rapids of the rivers Parana, La Plata, and Uruguay. The entire territory was covered with a network of reductions. As early as 1654, the Jesuits Machida and Cataladino obtained from the Spanish crown an exemption of the realm of the Society of Jesus from subordination to the Spanish colonial forces and from paying tithes to the local bishop. The authorization to arm the Indians was a further exception to the absolute ban introduced by the Spanish government in all parts of South America. The Jesuits soon had a strong fighting force at their disposal. In their dealings with the Spanish government, the Jesuits steadfastly denied that they had created an independent state in Paraguay. It is true that certain accusations were exaggerated, as for example the book about the so-called Emperor of Paraguay, which included his portrait, as well as coins allegedly minted at court, both being nothing but a contrivance of the Jesuits' enemies. But it is also a fact that the area controlled by the Jesuits was so isolated from the external world that it could in fact be considered an independent state or a dominion of Spain. Jesuits were the only Europeans in the region. They prevailed on the government to pass a law that allowed no European to enter the territory of the reductions without the Jesuits' permission. In any case, no visitor was allowed to stay longer than 3 days. The Indians were not able to leave their reductions except in the company of the Fathers. In spite of numerous government demands, the Jesuits refused to teach the Indians the Spanish language. They devised a writing system for the local Guarani language. The Jesuits who lived in the area were not Spaniards for the most part, but included Germans, Italians, and Scots. The territory had an army of its own and engaged in independent foreign trade. All this does tend to justify the term Jesuit State, which is used by most scholars who have written on the subject. The population of the Jesuit state at the height of its development was 150,000 to 200,000 inhabitants. Most of these were Indians. In addition, there were some 12,000 black slaves and between 150 and 300 Jesuits. The state came to an end in 1767 to 1768, when the Jesuits were driven out of Paraguay as part of the general campaign of the Spanish government against the movement. In 1773, the Society of Jesus was abolished altogether by Pope Clement XIV. The main organizational principles of the reductions were worked out by Father Diego de Torres. It is significant that he began his missionary work in Peru, where the Inca state had not yet been entirely forgotten. The Spanish authorities were exploiting the rich silver mines in the area, and they were concerned about keeping the Indians in one place. To this end, it was proposed that the social structure of the Inca period be maintained in its essentials. As he called for the setting up of reductions in Paraguay, Diego de Torres wrote that, quote, "The locality must be governed by the same system as in Peru." Unquote. Many observers have come to the conclusion that the Jesuits consciously copied the structure of the Inca Empire. As already mentioned, the entire population of Jesuit Paraguay was concentrated in the reductions. These usually numbered some 2,000 to 3,000 Indians, with the smallest ones containing about 500 inhabitants and the biggest mission, Saint Javier, numbering 30,000. Each reduction was run by 2 Jesuit fathers, one being as a rule much older than the other. There were generally no other Europeans in the settlement. The senior father, or confessor, devoted himself primarily to religious functions, while the younger acted as his assistant and directed economic matters. Together the two possessed absolute power in the reduction. As the Jesuit Juan de Escadon states, in a letter written in 1760, quote, "Secular power belongs totally to the fathers, as much as or even more than spiritual power." Unquote. The priests normally appeared before the Indians only at divine services. At other times, they communicated with them through intermediaries drawn from the local population. These local officials, called corregidores and alcaldes, were selected annually from a list compiled by the fathers. Election was by a show of hands. The corregidores and alcaldes were completely subordinate to the fathers, who could abolish or change any of the former's orders. De Escadon writes that the corregidores and alcaldes reported to one of the fathers every morning to get their decisions approved and to receive instructions as to the work order of the day. Quote, "This was accomplished as in a good family, where the father tells everyone what he must do for the day." Unquote. And quote, "The limited intelligence of the Indians compelled the missionaries to take care of all affairs and to guide them in secular as well as in spiritual matters." End quote. As the Jesuit Charlevoix, in History of Paraguay, quotes his contemporary Antonio de Ulloa, "There were no laws, only the decisions made by the fathers. They heard confession, which was obligatory for the Indians, and assigned penalties for all offenses. Penalties included face-to-face reprimand, public reprimand, flogging, imprisonment, and banishment from the reduction." Many authors assert that there was no capital punishment, although Charlevoix writes about a certain unsubmissive local official who was burned up in a fire sent by God. An offender was first made to repent in church, was dressed as a heretic, and was then subjected to the punishment. De Ulloa writes, quote, "They had such great confidence in their pastors that they regarded even an unprovoked penalty as deserved." End quote. The entire life of the reduction was based on the principle that the Indians were to possess practically nothing of their own, neither land nor houses nor raw materials nor handicraft tools. The Indians did not even belong to themselves. Thus, de Escadon writes, quote, "These plots, as with the other lands of the mission, belong to the community and no inhabitant has more than the right to use them. Therefore, they never sell anything to one another. The same is true of the houses in which they live. The community takes care of all the houses, makes repairs, and builds new ones as needed." End quote. The reduction was divided into 2 parts, Tupambe, God's land, and Abambe, private land. The difference was not in the form of tenure, since both types belonged to the mission, but simply that Tupambe was tilled collectively, while Abambe was divided into plots and distributed among individual families. Mirovoi writes that Abambe was lent to the Indians for working. A plot of land was granted to an Indian when he married. It was not hereditary, and if the man died, his widow and children did not retain the plot. The land reverted to a common fund and the dependents became wards of the mission. Charlevoix says that work on individual plots was regulated by the administration in the same way as on common land. In the monthly Catholic missions, it was reported that seeds and tools for working the individual plots were lent by the community. In the majority of missions, families lived on crops harvested from their individual plots. However, in certain reductions they were required to deliver a part of their harvest to the mission, with rations later dispensed in return. In any case, work on the individual plots and the crops produced on them were under strict control everywhere. Charlevoix writes, "It was known how much a plot of land yielded and the crops from it were under the supervision of those who were particularly concerned with looking after it. And if there had been no strict hand over the Indians, they would soon have found themselves with no means of subsistence." End quote. Work on the communal land was obligatory for all Indians, including administrators and artisans. Before work, one of the fathers delivered a sermon. The Indians then set out for the fields in columns, to the sound of drum and flute. They returned from work singing uplifting songs. Work was supervised at all times by inspectors and spies who apprehended idlers. Quote. Culprits were severely punished, end quote. Writes Muratori. All crops essential to the mission's economy were grown on communal land. Eyewitnesses are unanimous in pointing out differences in the cultivation of individual and communal lands. While communal lands were carefully tilled, the individual plots looked neglected. The Jesuits constantly complained of the indifference of the Indians to working their own fields. They preferred to be punished for a badly cultivated plot and to live on the communal stores. The Indians were capable of eating the seed grain distributed to them and coming back for more and a sound flogging several times over. The Jesuits saw the reason for this not in the peculiarities of the social system they had established but in the so-called childish nature of the Indians. Father J. Cardiel wrote in 1758, "For 140 years we have been fighting this, but there has hardly been any improvement. And so long as they have but a child's intelligence, things will not get better." End quote. The communities possessed huge herds of horses and oxen that were pastured in the pampas. Communal oxen were given to the Indians to work their plots. Quote. Sometimes the Indian kills one or both oxen to eat meat at his pleasure. He later reports that they have become lost and pays for the loss with his back. End quote. The meat of communal oxen was distributed among the residents 2 or 3 times a week. On the appointed day, the inhabitants came to the storehouse, where the storekeeper called everyone's name and dispensed a standard portion of meat. Indians also received a ration of local tea. Various crafts were encouraged in the reductions, and a high level of workmanship was achieved. Wool was dispensed to the women to be spun at home, the finished cloth being collected on the following day. All tools and raw materials belonged to the reduction and not to the individual craftsman. Moreover, a large part of the craftsmen worked in communal workshops. José Cardiel writes, quote, "All craft work is done not in the home, since that would be very ineffective, it is performed in the courtyards of the collegium." End quote. The missions had stonemasons, brickmakers, arms makers, millers, clockmakers, artists, jewelers, and potters. Construction included brick factories, kilns for producing quicklime, mills powered by horses and by men. Organs were made, bells cast, books printed in foreign languages, for export. By the beginning of the 18th century, every reduction had a sundial or a mechanical clock of local manufacture, according to which the workday was regulated. All products were delivered to the storehouses, where Indians who could write and keep accounts were employed. Part of the production was distributed to the population. Fabrics were divided into equal pieces and distributed by name, one day to girls, the next to boys, then to men and finally to women. Each man was given 5.5 meters of canvas for clothing a year and each woman, 4.5 meters. Each received a knife and an axe once a year. The major portion of the articles produced in the reduction was for export. Given the large herds, vast amounts of tanned skins were produced. There were tanning and shoemaking shops in the missions, with the entire production being exported. Indians were not allowed to wear shoes. The artisan skills of the Indians amazed many observers. Charlevoix writes that the Guarani succeeded, quote, as though instinctively in any craft they undertook. For instance, it was enough to show them a crucifix, a candlestick, an amulet, and to give them the necessary material for them to make an identical copy. Their work could be distinguished from the original model only with difficulty. End quote. Other observers also stress the imitative character of the Indian craftsmanship. Trade did not exist either within reductions or between them. There was no money. Each Indian held a coin in his hands only once in his lifetime during the wedding ceremony, when he handed it as a gift to his bride, the coin being returned immediately thereafter to the priest. On the other hand, foreign trade was conducted on a large scale. Reductions exported, for instance, more local tea than all the rest of Paraguay. The Jesuit state was also compelled to import some items, above all, salt and metals, especially iron. All reductions were built according to one plan. In the center there was a square plaza on which a church was situated. The square was bordered by the jail, the workshops, storehouses, the armory, a weaving shop in which widows and female offenders worked, a hospital and a guest house. The rest of the territory was broken up into equal square blocks of houses. Clay-plastered cane cabins served as dwellings for the Indians. A hearth was located in the middle of the structure, smoke was allowed to go out through the door. People slept without beds, either on the floor or in a hammock. The Austrian Jesuit Sepp, who came to Paraguay in 1691, describes these houses as follows. Quote, "The dwellings of the natives are simple one-room cabins made of earth and brick. They have little to recommend them. Inside, father, mother, sisters and brothers crowd together with the dog, cats, mice, rats, etc. There are cockroaches everywhere. The stench is unbearable to someone unaccustomed to it." End quote. Funes writes in the Civil History of Paraguay that, quote, "The houses had neither windows nor any means of ventilation, there was also no furniture, all residents of the missions sat on the ground and ate on the ground." End quote. It was only shortly before they were driven out of Paraguay that the Jesuits began to build more suitable quarters for the Indians. The dwellings were not considered private property, and an Indian was not permitted to give his house away. In contrast to the Indian dwellings, the churches were impressive in their splendor. They were built of stone and richly decorated. The church in the mission of St. Javier accommodated between 4,000 and 5,000 persons. Its walls were overlaid with shiny plates of mica, the altars were covered with gold. At dawn a bell was rung to wake up the Indians and to call them to prayers, obligatory for all. They then went to work to another peal of the bells. They retired to bed on signal also, and after dark the settlement was patrolled by detachments of the most reliable Indians. Special permission was required to be outside at night. The reduction was surrounded by a wall and a moat. Gates were guarded carefully, entry and exit was forbidden without a pass. Contact among Indians from different reductions was not permitted. None of the Indians, except for soldiers and herdsmen, had the right to ride horseback. All means of conveyance, boats, canoes, carriages, belonged to the community. All Indians wore identical clothing made from material obtained from the communal stores. Only officials and officers dressed differently, but only when on duty. At other times, their uniforms and their arms were kept in a storehouse. Marriages were contracted twice a year at solemn ceremonies. The choice of a wife or husband was under control of the priests. If a youth took a liking to a girl or vice versa, this was taken into account and the party concerned was informed. But the fathers, apparently, also functioned independently and decided on marriages themselves, regardless of the young people's preferences. In at least one recorded instance, a large group of young men and women took flight in protest over these practices. After prolonged negotiations, they returned to the reduction, but the fathers were forced to sanction the marriages they demanded. Children began working at an early age. Charlevoix writes that, quote, "As soon as a child reached the age at which he could work, he was brought to a workshop and assigned to a craft." End quote. The Jesuits were concerned that the population of the reductions grew very little, despite unusually good conditions from the Indian point of view, such as medical aid and safeguards against famine. To stimulate the birth rate, they did not allow Indian males to wear long hair, a sign of adulthood, until the birth of a child. The same purpose was sought by ringing a bell at night summoning them to perform their so-called marital duties. The Jesuits justified their control over all aspects of the Indians' lives by reference to the latter's low development. The following judgment by Funes is typical. Quote, "Never acting according to reason, they ought to have several centuries of social childhood before reaching that maturity which is the preliminary condition of the full enjoyment of liberty." End quote. In the letter quoted earlier, the Jesuit Escadon writes, quote, "In truth and without the slightest exaggeration, none of them has greater faculty, intelligence, and capacity of common sense than as we observe in Europe in children who can read, write and learn, but who are nevertheless in no condition to decide for themselves." End quote. Meanwhile the Jesuits themselves were doing everything possible to stifle the Indians' initiative and interest in the results of their labor. In the Reglamento of 1689, we find the following advice. Quote, "It is permissible to give them something to make them feel satisfied, but this needs to be done in such a way that they do not develop a sense of interest." End quote. Only toward the end of their rule did the Jesuits try, no doubt for economic reasons, to promote private initiative, for instance, by turning over cattle to individuals. But these experiments failed to bring any results. One exception, recorded by Cardiel, was a case in which a small herd was built up, though its owner was a mulatto. The Jesuits' enemies, the anti-clerical writer Asura in particular, reproached them for having starved the Indians and burdened them with work. But the impression gained from Jesuit sources seems more convincing and logical: hunger-free existence, rest every Sunday, guaranteed dwelling, and a cloak. Yet this almost successful attempt at reducing hundreds of thousands of people to a life as lived in an ant-hill seems far more terrible a picture than that of a hard labor camp. The Jesuits in Paraguay, and elsewhere in the world, fell victim to their own success. They became too dangerous. In the reductions, they had created a well-equipped army of up to 12,000 men, which was apparently the predominant military force in the region. They interfered in internal conflicts and took the capital of Asunción by assault on more than one occasion. They defeated Portuguese troops and delivered Buenos Aires from a British siege. During a mutiny, the Viceroy of Paraguay, Don José de Antequera, was defeated by them. Several thousand Guarini participated in the battles, equipped with firearms and including some cavalry units. The Jesuit army began to inspire more and more apprehension in the Spanish government. The fall of the Jesuits was greatly hastened by the widespread rumors of the enormous riches they were supposed to be accumulating. There was talk of gold and silver mines and of fabulous revenue from foreign trade. The latter rumor seemed particularly plausible in view of cheap Indian labor and the unusual fertility of the land. After driving the Jesuits out, government officials rushed in to look for hidden treasure and discovered nothing. The storehouses in the reductions proved bitterly disappointing and contained none of the riches that they were supposed to yield. The economy had not been profitable. After the collapse of the Jesuit State, most of the Indians drifted away from the reductions and returned to their former religion and their nomadic way of life. It is interesting to note the appraisal given to Jesuit activity in Paraguay by the spokesman of the Enlightenment. Although the Jesuits were considered their greatest enemies, the Phi 1 Osophies could not find lofty enough terms to characterize the Paraguayan state. In the spirit of the laws Montesquieu writes, quote, "The Society of Jesus had the honor of proclaiming for the first time ever the idea of religion in combination with the idea of humanity. The Society attracted tribes scattered in villages, provided them with secure livelihood and clothed them. It will always be admirable to govern people so as to make them happy." End quote. And Voltaire, in this case speaking about Ellen Fame, expressed even greater respect in his essay on rights. Quote, "The spread of Christianity in Paraguay by the efforts of the Jesuits alone was, in a certain sense, a triumph of humanity." End quote.